I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about love and loss and the hard work of forgiving. But this one sat on my chest for days. I kept thinking about that boy, standing at the fence line on a Sunday morning, staring down an empty road, and I kept asking myself the same question he asked. Was it worth it? The boy who counted Sundays. Josiah Hollis knew the sound of that horse before he ever saw it. Every Sunday, same hour, same direction, hoofbeats rising off the 12-mile road from town, like a clock nobody wound but never stopped. The boy pressed his shoulder against the barn's south wall where the wood stayed cool even in July, and he watched through the gap between planks the way a hawk watches a field. Heat shimmered off the hardpan in waves thick enough to swim through. The saguaros stood with their arms raised, surrendering to a sun that took no prisoners. Here's something Josiah never told his mother. He'd been keeping count. 104 Sundays. The rider materialized out of the dust the way he always did, hat low, coat folded behind the saddle because nobody wore wool in Arizona July unless they aimed to die in it. Sheriff Everett Creed, 41 years old, straight-backed, quiet as a fence post and about half as talkative. He dismounted at the property line, looped the reins over the gate, and stood there a moment, looking at the place like a man surveying damage after a storm that only he remembered. Then he rolled his sleeves. That was the signal. Not a word to Mama, not a nod to Josiah if the boy happened to be visible, which Josiah made sure he wasn't. The sheriff walked to whatever needed doing and did it. Last month, it was the irrigation ditch that silted over. Month before, the corral fence where the top rail split clean through. Today, he went straight for the woodpile, pulled the axe from the stump, and started splitting juniper rounds like a man paying off a debt that didn't carry a dollar amount. Josiah watched those hands. Dry hands, cracked at the knuckles, skin split along the thumb line where the axe handle wore hardest. Hands that belonged to a man who worked with them regular, not just on Sundays, but Sundays were when he brought them here 12 miles of dust and heat, each direction for the privilege of chopping another woman's wood. His mother came out with a cup of water, set it on the porch rail, went back inside. The sheriff drank it when he got to it. That was the whole conversation. Glass of water on a rail. Silence heavy as the heat pressing down on all of them. Josiah had asked once, years back, when he was young enough to think questions had answers. Why does the sheriff come? Mama. She'd been kneading bread, her flour-dusted hands pausing just long enough to tell him the pause meant something. Some debts don't have words. Josiah, some folks pay what they owe the only way they know how. He was 10 then, didn't understand. He was 12 now, and understanding was coming whether he wanted it or not. The sheriff finished the wood by mid-afternoon, stacked it neater than Josiah would have bothered, neater than necessary, each log placed with a kind of precision that looked almost like apology. Then he put his coat back on, tipped his hat toward the house without looking at it, mounted up, and rode back the way he came. Didn't stay for supper, never did. Josiah stepped out from behind the barn and walked to the woodpile, ran his hand along the fresh split rounds, feeling the grain still warm from the axe, and he noticed something he'd never noticed before. Down near the bottom, older logs were stacked different from the rest, deliberate, like they were holding something in place rather than just sitting where they fell. He didn't pull them apart, not today, but he marked the spot in his mind the way you mark a rattler's den so you know exactly where to look when you come back with a shovel. 12 miles of dust. The ride home was the punishment. 12 miles of Arizona heat gave a man nothing to do but sit with himself. And Everett Creed had never been good company for the man inside his own head. He counted fence posts along the territorial road the way some men count rosary beads, not for the number, but for the rhythm. Something to keep the mind from wandering into the rooms where it wanted to go. Dark rooms. Rooms with no lamps and no doors and a sound in them he'd been hearing for 2 years. His horse knew the route, didn't need guidance. That was mercy and curse both, because it freed Creed's hands to rest on his thighs. And when they rested, he felt the cracks in them. Dry hands, always dry, no matter the season. He'd tried salve, tallow, even the old Mexican remedy maguey sap mixed with lard. Nothing held. The desert took the moisture out of a man's skin the way guilt took the ease out of his sleep. slow and thorough and permanent. 12 miles out, 12 miles back, 24 miles every Sunday for 2 years. He'd done the arithmetic once during a particularly long stretch of self-recrimination, roughly 2,500 miles. Far enough to walk to Virginia and partway home again. All of it circling the same piece of ground, the same woman's gate, the same grave behind the barn he never looked at because he didn't need to. The name was carved deep enough into his memory that stone was redundant. Marshal Jonas William Hollis, killed in the line of duty. They'd inscribed on the marker. And that was true in the way that a barn door is true when it's hanging by one hinge, technically upright, technically functional, but leaning so hard toward the ground that anyone with eyes could see it was only a matter of time before it fell. He passed through the outskirts of Ridgecrest as the sun angled toward the western mesas. A few folks nodded from their porches. He touched his hat brim and nodded back. Good sheriff, they said about him. Fair, keeps to himself, but fair. They didn't know the half of what lived under that fairness, and he intended to keep it buried not for his sake but for hers, for the boys. Nora Hollis had never asked him to come, never asked him to stop. She set water on the rail and went inside, and that arrangement suited the silence between them because it required no words. Words were the one thing Creed couldn't afford. Explanation would mean confession, and confession would serve his comfort, not hers. He'd decided that on the very first Sunday, riding out with his tools and his quiet and the weight of a dead man's last request sitting on his shoulders like a yoke. He'd held to it since, with the same iron discipline that made him a passable lawman and a miserable human being. Back at the office, he hung his hat on the peg by the door, sat at the desk, and unpinned his badge, set it beside the lamp where it caught the last daylight. Newer metal, polished bright, the badge of a sheriff, not the badge of a deputy, a promotion bought with another man's last breath. Somewhere in a woodpile 12 miles south, an older badge sat wrapped in oilcloth, rusted and engraved, carrying a name that matched a headstone. Creed had put it there because he couldn't wear it and couldn't bury it in the dirt and couldn't throw it in the river. So he hid it the only place that felt honest, as close to the man's family as he could get without handing them the truth. He flexed his dry hands under the lamplight and watched the cracks widen like tiny arroyos waiting for rain that never came. The heat that doesn't break. Midweek. The thermometer nailed to the general store porch read 109, and nobody argued with it. Josiah hauled water from the well in buckets that grew heavier every trip. The creek had thinned to a trickle. The cattle bunched together under the single cottonwood for shade that shrank by the hour, and his mother moved through her chores with the grim efficiency of a woman who'd learned that stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant drowning in the things that couldn't be undone. She'd been that way since Pa died, not broken, bent, like mesquite in a wind that never quit blowing. Can I tell you what kept Everett Creed awake every Saturday night? The same thing that made Josiah's mother set an extra place at supper she always cleared before anyone could notice. Some absences have weight. They sit in chairs and lean against door frames and stand at the foot of beds at 3 in the morning when the rest of the world is sleeping. Jonas Hollis had been dead 2 years, and he was still the loudest silence in that house. Josiah went to the woodpile Thursday afternoon, came for kindling, axe over his shoulder. And there it was, that bottom section where the logs sat too neat, too purposeful. He knelt in the dirt, pulled one log aside, saw the dark edge of oilcloth against pale juniper wood. His hands stopped moving. He could feel his heartbeat in his dry fingertips. The heat pressed on his back like a flat palm trying to push him into the ground. A horned lizard watched from the fence post with ancient, expressionless eyes. He set the log back. Not because he was afraid, because he wanted to know on his own terms, not by accident, not in a rush. He wanted to come back when the house was empty and the sheriff was 24 miles distant, and he wanted to pull that cloth aside with steady hands and a mind clear enough to understand whatever was underneath. Saturday morning. His mother would take the wagon to the general store. He'd have an hour. He scratched a small cross on the end grain of the log with his thumbnail as mark. Invisible to anyone who wasn't looking, and stood up, wiped his palms on his trousers. The dust mixed with sweat and left his hands gritty. Raw, dry hands, like the sheriff's hands. He noticed that similarity and didn't care for it one bit. The heat didn't break. In July, it never did. It just leaned harder against everything that was still standing and waited for something to give. Rust and bone. Saturday morning, Nora took the wagon to town. Josiah waited until the dust on the road settled flat and still, then walked to the woodpile with his hands washed and his breathing steady. He'd made sure of that, stood in the barn doorway, drawing air slow and deep until the trembling stopped. A man about to open something that might be a grave ought to have control of his hands, even if the man was 12 years old. He found the cross he'd scratched, pulled the logs away one by one, stacking each in the dirt beside him with the care of someone dismantling something sacred. The oilcloth was tucked deep, folded around an object small and hard. He lifted it out, heavier than he expected. He unwrapped it sitting cross-legged in the thin shade of the woodpile, the cloth falling open in his lap like a dark bloom. Inside a badge, metal corroded to the color of old blood, edges veined with green verdigris, the clasp pin on the back bent but unbroken. He rubbed his thumb across the face, clearing grit and oxidation the way a man brushes dirt from a gravestone, and letters appeared under the pressure of his skin. One letter at a time, like the earth releasing a name it had swallowed. Marshal, and beneath it, engraved in a copperplate hand some Eastern craftsman had carved with precision and professional pride, Jonas W. Hollis. Josiah's thumb stopped moving. The heat roared in his ears, or maybe that was blood. He read the name again, swallowed hard against something rising in his throat. Then he stood knees unsteady despite his preparations and walked around the barn to the headstone, white stone, weathered, leaning slightly eastward the way everything in Arizona tilts from the afternoon sun. Jonas William Hollis, beloved husband and father, 1849-1887. Same name, same man, his father's badge. Hidden in the woodpile by the man who rode 12 miles every Sunday to split wood and mend fences and drink water off a porch rail without ever once saying a word about why. Josiah wrapped the badge back in the oilcloth with hands that had gone perfectly still. The stillness that comes not before grief, but before fury. He put it in his trouser pocket where the metal pressed against his thigh like an ember that refused to cool. Then he restacked every log exactly as the sheriff had placed them, matching the angles, preserving the deception. He sat on the porch step and waited for his mother to come home. When she did, he helped carry the flour and salt inside and said nothing about what sat in his pocket burning a hole through the fabric and into his skin. What Josiah found that morning changed everything, and I wish I could tell you it made things better. The badge sat in his pocket through supper, through evening chores, through the long, hot night tucked under his pillow where the metal warmed to the exact temperature of his anger and held it there without cooling. 2 badges. Everett Creed pinned his badge every morning at 6:15. Same motion, same angle, same spot over his left breast pocket where the fabric had worn a small pale circle from 2 years of daily friction. The metal caught the early light through his office window and threw a bright chip of reflection against the far wall like a tiny signal lamp. He poured coffee from the pot on the stove black, bitter, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and drank it standing at the window watching Ridgecrest come awake. The baker propping open his door, the freight wagon from Tucson rolling in with its canvas cover dusty and loose, the school bell, distant and thin. A man's badge is supposed to mean something clean, authority, service, the public trust. His meant all that and something else underneath, something that lived below the surface like rot beneath fresh paint. Because the badge he wore every morning wasn't the first one he'd ever carried. The first belonged to another man. And he'd lifted it from that man's coat while the man bled into Arizona dirt and whispered 4 words Everett Creed would hear every night for the rest of his natural life. He touched the badge now, an unconscious gesture, 2 fingers pressing metal against chest. His deputies probably thought it was habit, the boss checking his star the way other men check a pocket watch. They didn't know he was touching a ghost. Meanwhile, 12 miles south, another hand was pressing another badge for entirely different reasons. Josiah went to old Virgil Merriweather at the livery Tuesday afternoon. Virgil was 72, had been in Ridgecrest since before it had a name worth remembering, and possessed the kind of memory that misplaced his coffee cup 3 times a morning, but recalled every significant event in the territory for 4 decades running. "Virgil, You remember my pa?" The old man looked up from the bridle he was mending. His eyes went careful the way old men's eyes go when they see a question approaching that might require more truth than comfort. "I surely do, son. Jonas Hollis was as fine a lawman as this territory ever produced. Straight as a string and twice as tough. How'd he die?" Virgil set down the bridle, leaned back on his stool. "Your mama ain't told you the particulars. She said in the line of duty. That's all she ever says." Virgil rubbed the back of his neck where sweat and leather dust had caked into a permanent patina. "There was a night raid. September of '87. Rustlers been hitting ranches south of town something fierce. Your pa and his deputy rode out after him in the dark, darker than the inside of a cow, pardon my saying." He paused, studied the boy's face. "Something went wrong out there. Shots were fired in the confusion. Your daddy would have wanted you to know he died brave. Son, that's the God's honest truth." "Who was his deputy?" Virgil's weathered hands went still on his knees, just for a heartbeat, the space between one breath and the next. Then he picked up the bridle again and gave it his full attention. "I reckon that's a question best put to your mama, boy." But Josiah didn't need the answer spoken aloud. The shape of it was already clear, pressed hard against his thigh and a dead man's corroded badge. Deputy Everett Creed, who fired a shot in the dark at a shape that moved wrong, who got promoted to sheriff after, who rides 12 miles every Sunday to mend what he shattered. The town meeting fell on the second Tuesday. 8 days from now. Josiah walked home with his father's name in his pocket and his plan taking a shape that was cold and bright and felt exactly like justice. The sharpening. The heat wave hit its cruelest pitch the first full week of August. Wells dropped to mud. The Garza cattle broke through a fence line seeking water and found nothing but cracked earth on the other side. Old Mrs. Farnham fainted outside the general store and had to be carried to the shade of the livery awning, where Virgil fanned her with his hat and muttered about heat that had no business being this personal. Tempers in town split like the ground two men who'd been neighbors since the territory days threw fists at the water trough over whose stock drank first. Josiah sharpened his plan the way he sharpened the axe, steady strokes, same angle, until the edge was fine enough to split a thought in half. He knew what he would do. The town meeting happened every second Tuesday. The whole settlement turned out. The sheriff stood at the front conducting business. There would be no shadows to hide in and no silence to retreat to. Every face in the territory would be watching. "You feeling all right?" his mother asked Wednesday evening over supper. She was studying him across the table with that look she had, the one that saw through walls and weather and years of practiced quiet. "Yes, ma'am. Just the heat is all." "You've been awful quiet this week. Ain't much worth saying." Nora set down her fork, considered him. He could see her deciding whether to push weighing his age against his stubbornness, her instinct against his privacy. Then she picked the fork back up and let it go. The way she let most hard things go these days, not because she didn't see them coming, but because she'd learned that some things had to work their way out on their own time. Like splinters. What Josiah couldn't know, what nobody his age could know, is that the version of justice you build inside your head never matches the one that happens in the room. He'd imagined the sheriff's face when the badge hit wood, had pictured the gasps, the turning heads, the reckoning arriving like a verdict handed down from on high. He'd rehearsed his words behind the barn, standing before his father's headstone like a lawyer addressing a jury of ghosts. In his mind, the scene was clean and righteous and complete. The real thing would be none of those. Sunday came. The sheriff rode in at the usual hour, mended the corral gate, split half a quart of mesquite, drank water off the rail, left before the shadows reached the barn. Josiah watched from the kitchen window this time, standing behind the curtain his mother had sewn from flour sacks, his dry hands gripping his father's badge so hard the bent pin drew a bead of blood from the meat of his palm. He let it bleed, didn't wipe it. The sting felt like preparation. 3 days until the meeting. Saturday night. The lamp in the sheriff's office burned past midnight. Everett Creed sat at his desk with the badge laid flat before him, a polishing rag in one hand and a tin of Brasso in the other, working the metal in slow circles the way a man works a wound he knows won't heal but can't stop touching. Outside, The night was suffocating. No breeze. Heat stored in adobe and stone releasing into air that couldn't hold another degree. Distant thunder muttered along the southern horizon, making promises it had made every night this week and broken every morning. Tomorrow was the second Tuesday. Town meeting. He could feel it coming, the way a man feels weather turning before the clouds form a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the joints, something animal and old. The boy had changed. Something in his watching had sharpened these last weeks, hardened, gone from the soft curiosity of a child to something with edges and intent. Here's the part that'll stay with you longest. Everett Creed had wanted to confess from that very first Sunday. He'd ridden out to the Hollis place with the words stacked in his throat like cordwood, ready to spill. But halfway up the road he'd understood something that stopped him cold in the saddle. Confession would lighten his load. Confession would ease his chest and let him draw a full breath for the first time in weeks. Confession was for himself. And he'd decided, sitting his horse in the middle of that 12-mile road with the dust settling around him like a judgment, that Nora and her boy deserved more than his relief. So he picked up a hammer instead of his pride, rode out every Sunday and mended what was broken and kept his mouth shut and accepted that silence was the price of the thing he'd taken. Not penance exactly, not charity, just the only honest currency he had left. The memory came unbidden, the way it always did on Saturday nights when the polishing was done and there was nothing left between him and the dark. September 1887. Cattle thieves hitting the ranches south of Ridgecrest hard enough to make it personal. Marshal Hollis said they'd ride out after dark, catch them at the loading point near Sycamore Creek, 2 men only. A posse makes noise. Ev, we ride quiet, we ride smart, we ride home for breakfast. They didn't all ride home. Mesquite thicket, moonless night, shapes moving through brush that could have been men or cattle or shadows thrown by nothing at all. The marshal went left, Creed went right. Something crashed through the scrub to Creed's east heavy. Fast, wrong direction. He pivoted in the saddle and fired. The sound Jonas Hollis made when the bullet struck was the quietest thing Everett Creed had ever heard. Quieter than the gunshot, quieter than the horse stamping. Just a soft exhale, like a man setting down a burden he'd been carrying too long and couldn't hold anymore. Creed held him in the dirt. The marshal's hand found Creed's collar and pulled him close with strength that had no business being in a dying man's grip. His eyes were already going distant, looking past Creed's shoulder at something that wasn't there and never would be again. Take care of them. Ev. 4 words, whole life sentence. Creed set down the polishing rag, flexed his cracked hands under the lamplight, left both badges on the desk, his own bright star and the phantom of the one wrapped in oilcloth 12 miles south, turned down the lamp, sat in the dark and waited for morning the way a man waits for a verdict he already knows. The badge on the table. The meeting hall smelled of sweat and kerosene and the particular tension that forms when too many bodies crowd too small a space in heat that won't relent. Every chair was filled. Folks lined the walls, fanning themselves with hymnals and folded newspapers and whatever else was flat enough to push air. The doors stood propped wide, but no breeze came through the air outside, had died sometime before noon and showed no sign of resurrection. Sheriff Creed stood at the front table conducting business in a voice that carried clean and steady to every corner. Water rights dispute between the Simmons and Garza families, territorial road assessment, request for a new well at the south end of town, ordinary matters for an ordinary Tuesday evening. Josiah sat beside his mother on the third bench. The badge in his pocket weighed 10 pounds. His mouth was dry as the creek bed. His hands were slick with sweat, and he wiped them on his trousers and saw the rust they left behind a faint red smear on brown fabric, like a signature in a language only he could read. Nora glanced sideways at him. "You're fidgeting." "Yes, ma'am. Any other business?" The sheriff's voice reached them from the front of the hall, steady and authoritative, the voice of a man people trusted with their disputes and their safety and the quiet order of their daily lives. Josiah stood up. The bench creaked under the shift of weight. A few heads turned with mild curiosity. Nora's hand reached for his arm, but he was already moving, walking up the center aisle between the rows of neighbors and shopkeepers and ranchers, with his heart slamming so loud against his ribs He was certain the whole room could hear the percussion of it. The sheriff watched him come, and something in the man's face shifted to surprise. Recognition. The look of a man who's been waiting for a jury foreman to stand and has just heard the chair push back. Josiah reached the front table, put his hand in his pocket, drew out the oilcloth bundle, unwrapped it with fingers that trembled only once before going steady, letting the cloth fall away until the badge sat in his palm, rust and verdigris, and his father's engraved name catching the lamplight like something dragged up from a riverbed. He set it on the table. The sound of corroded metal on pine was the loudest thing that room had ever heard. "This was my pa's badge." His voice came out clear, clearer than he expected. "I found it in our woodpile." He looked at the sheriff. "Where you put it?" Silence, the kind that has its own weight and temperature and presses on the skin like a hand. Every face in the hall turned from the boy to the man. Nora's palm pressed flat against her chest as if holding something inside from escaping. Old Virgil, standing by the back wall, lowered his eyes to the floor. Everett Creed looked at the badge on the table, looked at the boy standing before him with Jonas Hollis's jaw and Jonas Hollis's eyes, and did not deny. He told the truth standing straight, his dry hands open at his sides, palms turned upward as if offering them for binding. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew." His voice didn't break. It bent the way good steel bends under weight before it either holds or snaps. "We rode out together the night of September 14th, 1887. I fired at a shape in the dark." He paused. Every breath in the room held itself. "That shape was him, and I am the reason you grew up without a father." The first drops of rain hit the tin roof. Soft at first, hesitant, then harder. A sound like the sky itself had been holding something too long and simply couldn't anymore. Nora was crying, silent and still. The tears tracking through dust on her cheeks the way rain tracks through desert hardpan, finding channels that had been dry a long time and filling them all at once. Josiah stood with his father's badge lying between them on the pine table, and the thing he'd imagined for weeks, the satisfaction, the righteousness. The bright, clean blade of justice wasn't there. In its place was something with no name. His arms hung at his sides like they'd forgotten what they were built for. He'd expected denial. He'd prepared for a fight. He'd sharpened himself for resistance the way you sharpen a blade for wood. Instead, the man had stood there and bled the truth out like opening a vein. And now Josiah held a verdict he'd won and couldn't find a place to put it down. The rain fell harder. Nobody in the hall moved. The road on Sunday. The heat wave broke that night. Rain came down 3 days straight, washing the territory clean, every roof and fence post and headstone scrubbed back to its honest color. The creek filled. The cattle spread out from under the cottonwood and wandered back to their usual grazing. The desert came up smelling the way it only smells after a long thirst is broken creosote and wet stone, and the particular sweetness of earth that had been waiting so long it had almost forgotten what water tasted like. Sunday morning, first clear day. Josiah stood at the fence line and looked down the 12-mile road. It was empty. No dust rising. No hoofbeats building slow and steady in the distance. No rider appearing out of the shimmer the way one had every Sunday for 104 weeks before this one. The road stretched south through saguaro and scrub and shimmering heat-cleaned air. And nothing moved on it but a single roadrunner picking its careful way between puddles that reflected the sky. The gate hinge hung loose. His mother had mentioned it at breakfast, just mentioned it, the way you mention weather, with no weight behind the words and no expectation attached. The woodpile sat stacked and ordinary. Just logs now, just fuel for a stove and nothing more. The axe rested in the stump where the sheriff had left it 2 Sundays past. The hammer leaned against the fence post where it had leaned for weeks. The handle smooth from a man's grip, waiting for hands that weren't riding out this morning or any morning after. Nora came out to the porch with her coffee. She stood and looked at the same empty road. Neither of them had spoken about the meeting. The silence between them now was a different animal from the old silence, thinner, more careful, carrying the weight of a truth that had been spoken in front of the whole territory and could never be unspoken again. Josiah reached into his pocket. The badge sat in his palm, rust flaking onto skin that was dry and cracked from sun and work and gripping things too hard for too long. He looked at his own hands, studied them the way you study something that's changed without your permission. They looked like the sheriff's hands. Same splits along the knuckle line, same raw places where the axe handle wore the skin thin. He was 12 years old, and his hands could have belonged to a man of 40. He walked to the fence post nearest the gate and set the badge in its shadow. Not hidden the way it had been hidden in the woodpile, not displayed the way he'd displayed it on the meeting hall table. Just resting in the dirt where it caught the morning light and gave it back dull and red, like something that had finished being a weapon and didn't know yet what else to be. Then he picked up the hammer. The gate hinge wasn't complicated work. 2 screws loosened by weather and the bracket wanting to be reset and tightened against the post. He'd watched the sheriff do this repair, had memorized the motion without ever intending to the angle of the hammer, the patience with the screw, the way you brace the hinge steady with your free hand while the other one works. Nora came down from the porch, didn't speak. She took the axe from the stump, set a juniper log on the splitting block, and brought the blade down clean. The sound rang out across the yard, sharp and definite and right, the sound of a woman who'd been doing for herself long before any sheriff rode in and would be doing for herself long after the road went quiet. They worked without words, mother and son. The hammer rang against metal. The axe bit into wood. The sun climbed the eastern sky the way it always did, indifferent and reliable. Sometimes the truth sets you free, and sometimes it just empties the road. Josiah learned that long, dry summer what every man learns sooner or later, that knowing and healing aren't the same country, even if they share a border, that you can chase an answer all the way to the end of your anger and find yourself standing in a silence bigger than the question ever was. That revenge fills your fist but empties your chest, and that some Sundays, the only person who's going to mend the fence is you. Rain puddles still sat on the 12-mile road, silver and flat and wide. They reflected the sky blue and clean and open and perfectly, terribly empty. Nobody rode through them, but the gate hinge held. Narrator closing. His story ended there. But yours didn't. Maybe somebody's been showing up for you, mending things, carrying weight, doing the quiet work that never gets explained. Or maybe you've been the one riding those 12 miles every Sunday, paying a debt that doesn't have words. Either way, the question isn't whether the truth was worth it. The question is what you pick up after it's been told.